In this video, what we're going to do is take a quick look at Cinema 4D's newest feature, its updated particle system, which now works with the rest of Cinema 4D's simulation tools. There are lots of cool things going on here. I'm going to have to spend a bunch more time getting comfortable with all of the new modifiers and all the great things we can now do with these particles, but let's go ahead and get started. Well, it looks like Maxon released a new version of Cinema 4D, or as they're calling it, their spring 2024 release, where the big thing that they've really updated here is the particle system. So the particle system now works with Cinema 4D's other simulation types, Pyro, Cloth, Soft bodies, and rigid bodies. So that's really interesting. Still works with Redshift. Do make sure you update Redshift though, if you do want it to work correctly. I ran into that issue myself. And there's also some new presets in the asset browser, which can help us kind of reverse engineer some stuff. I do want to point out that there were some really interesting Redshift updates as well, including some stylized tune type stuff for cell shading and whatnot. So that's going to be really interesting and something I'm sure I'll make a video about at some point. But let's just create a new scene here. What you can do if you want to find some of those new files they talked about in the asset browser is find the particle section here or just search particle. And I don't know if all of these are for the new. I think they are. But it's a great way to kind of reverse engineer and see how we can work with the new particle system. I do also believe they mentioned there was something on Cineversity about the new particle system as well. So yeah, the big thing right here in our particles, we have new emitters. There's now particle groups, which can be very helpful. Conditions, which is somewhat similar to if-then statements. If you've worked with X particles, this probably won't be too difficult to understand. And then modifiers, a whole bunch of different ways we can work with these particles, change these particles right here. So let's go ahead and just create this. Now, when you create an emitter, it does get placed in a particle group, and that happens in the emitter itself, not on the group, which I kind of thought it might, have a little section here like include, exclude, whatnot for emitters, but that's actually done here. Now, particle groups do play an important role here, and it's also how you tell your particles to render. This is what you would actually add the Redshift object tag to. Notice you see the particle section here. When I tried to apply the Redshift object tag to, say, the particle group, at first I wasn't getting this particle section, and it's because I had not updated Redshift as well. I just updated Cinema 4D. So keep that in mind. You probably want to update both pieces of software inside the Maxon app. But that's really interesting about these groups here. I should also point out that you can group groups. So if you want to do several of the same things, especially when it comes to geometry stuff, you can combine multiple groups inside of one. And so that can be really powerful. Now, just looking at our basic emitter, the settings here, the properties are not terribly different than what you might have seen in either Cinema 4D's particle systems or other particle systems like X particles. There's a property for life, for speed and velocity. I find it interesting that I don't see the word random as much as I would like. There is some of that here if you switch the direction, but in terms of speed, oops, didn't mean to keyframe that. We're not necessarily seeing the word random right away. Instead, what you need to do is twirl these things down, which I think is a little bit confusing for some of these properties, but it is there. So make sure you're kind of twirling these things down as much as possible when you're, trying to set these things up, because some of the properties are hidden, and I wish they're a little bit easier to find, or it was marked a little bit better that there's something here. Okay, so we have speed variance, which is great. You can introduce randomness in the direction and plenty of options there for how you want to work with that. Whether or not you want the velocity or speed of the emitter to be taken into consideration. And when you see things like linear and angular, linear means, positional movement. Angular is going to mean rotational values, right? Rotation. I didn't want to say movement because that wouldn't make sense. You have different alignments. This deals with the kind of direction the particle is facing. So whether you want it to be based on a specific axis, the velocity, normal direction, that's important if you're saying emitting from geometry, random, target if you wanted to look at something, as well as some other options here to spread and add a little bit of variation to those. So angular velocity, once again, rotation. Okay, and you can see we have some different options there. Color. Okay, I think this is one of the cooler things that you can do right away without having to do a whole lot of work, whether it's to add random colors to your particles, and you should see those colors in your particles right away. Okay, or noise if you want to go that route. Okay, you also have radius, which, while I haven't experimented with it myself, probably makes a difference when it comes to simulations. And so definitely make sure you're paying close attention to that. I will be curious to know if that's also affected when you set the size here, right? So that might be where you set the size, not just for simulations, but just the general size of the particle as well. So, that's it for the basic emitter. I will say, let's just set this to axis just to kind of show this. I was experimenting with this just a little bit beforehand, and I was actually able to get quite a few particles on screen at once without this really slowing down too much. Now, what I didn't do is actually a lot of simulation with it, which I suspect will slow things down. But let's kind of see what we get here when we come into animation, or emission, I should say. Adjust the rate, and you can see we're able to get quite a few here. Now, this is 1,000 per second. You may be going, well, that's great. What if we did 1,000 per frame? All right, so 1,000 per frame here, and we're still well above 30 frames per second. I'll be curious to know if 10,000 makes a difference. And so yeah, that's a ridiculous amount of particles. Now, once again, we're not doing a whole lot to them, really anything yet. So all of that can change once we start adding in dynamics, other modifiers, things like that. So let's reduce that just to make my computer's life, a little bit easier. Now, to take a look at the mesh emitter, what I have is just a figure here that I've made editable, and I right-clicked and connect objects and delete to combine everything into a single object. So back here, we can choose our mesh emitter, and in case it didn't choose our figure as the geometry, that is the first thing you would want to do in the emission tab, is make sure the figure is chosen as the geometry here. And with that, once we rewind this, we should see particles being emitted from our geometry. We have a couple of different modes here for how those particles can be emitted: point, surface, as well as volume, as well as a few different ways of restricting it. And I really like what they've started doing here, and that is to show you what type of tags you can use in the restriction field here. And this also is visible in the property maps section. So we have our selection tag here. We also have our vertex map tag that can be used in this field. So pretty much the same emission properties here other than that. Same with the properties section as well, all right? Somewhat similar, very similar in fact, but this property maps section is what's different. And that's because you can, as I mentioned, use whether it's vertex map or vertex color map to control these different properties here. So for instance, we could do this with, say, radius or even color, but let's do radius. We can come to our figure. I've already created a vertex map, and I'm going to drag that vertex map into the radius map. Now, one of the things I noticed that's new about vertex maps is there's no longer a, checkbox for fields. Instead, it's use transfer. Okay, I'm not sure why the name changed. Probably if I read the release notes a little bit more, it would have made sense. But what I can do here is add a linear field, and then working with this linear field just so we can kind of get it to work on a single part of our object here, right? That should now influence the radius. Now, if we're not seeing it, well, that's probably because we don't have a property set up to show in our emitter. So we have our radius here. All right, but let's also tell it to draw the geometry as well. Okay, and I also recall seeing something in our particle group, draw radius, which is going to be important because that is what we're trying to control here. So seemed like a quite a few different things here. I think really it just happened to be the worst case scenario where if I just came here first, that would have worked. But draw radius, you can see the radius now is being affected by our field. And while that's definitely one way you can control these different properties, that is an important part of this new particle system, is that it's no longer the only way of doing this, as we'll see. So let's get rid of that vertex map. We've talked about the mesh emitter a decent amount. Another thing I should mention about the particle group here is that you have the ability to cache out particles per group. And I think I recall seeing that you can now cache everything, right? All your simulations into an external file. I think that was the case, although I'm guessing it maybe wasn't for some things if they're saying it's now new, but that can be very useful, especially if you're trying to render on a render farm. You can have separate files. Not everything is stored in the Cinema 4D file, which can be very helpful. So we have some, playback controls as well when you're working with cache simulations. So let's take a look now at some of the other things we can do. Okay. I'm going to skip the reproduce and spline emitters for now. The spline emitter, pretty similar to emitting to the emitters we've seen, just using a spline object. The reproduce, from what I've seen, is used to kind of make particles spawn when different conditions are met or when different things happen. So that can be nice for, say, making, rain split when it hits the ground or something like that. All right, so let's come here to these conditions. You have three different types of conditions you can work with here. You have the condition, the field condition, and the time condition. And these conditions allow you to then apply a modifier. So for instance, I can choose a condition and I'm going to place it in the particle group. All right, the hierarchy here maybe could be a little bit clearer, but it is my understanding that you want the condition to be a child of the particle group, and then you want the modifier, right? What that condition is going to do to be a child of the condition, right? Just like how modifiers are typically the children of whatever you want it to work on. So in your condition here, you have a bunch of different properties to use here, all right? So whatever you want that condition to be related to, what property it to be on, whether it's age, whether it's color, distance, speed, radius, all of those things. So for instance, we could set it to say, let's just do age. But I will point out here that, you are going to get slightly different properties for the different options. So whether it's color, whether it's distance traveled, right? Obviously, there's going to be a distance value somewhere in there. It is a little bit different, all right? I like that they have some of these other ones as well. Angular velocity speed, how fast something is rotating. But if we can just do age, all right, it's just going to use the value, right? The value of the age. How old is our particle? And then we're going to say whether we want it to combine, right? So these conditions can be a few different things, okay? And as well as equals. It can be or instead of equals. So that can be useful for working with other conditions, but in our case, it's really just equals, all right? And we have the value we want to set for our property, in this case, the age. So we could say like at 10 frames. So the condition is when our particles reach 10 frames, okay, what are we gonna have them do? All right, you can also control the chance of this. So there is some randomness there. Very happy to see that. And we also have a seed value, which could change the randomness or chance that we're seeing there. But so we've decided to set our property to age and the condition and the amount of time for the age to be 10 frames. Now we need to tell it to do something to these particles, like let's just say kill. All right, make this a child of our condition. And so now our particles are being killed at the age of 10 frames. And we can lower the chance for that, right? So now it's really only 1 in 3 particles that is being killed at the age of 10. Now we could combine this with a different one. So it's and then we could add another kill that maybe is a little bit longer. You could also change the color as well. But you can combine these modifiers to work with each other or not. right? It can do one thing or another, okay? So that's the general approach here. We can do another one just for fun. Let's do color mapper, right? So condition. So now what we're seeing is our particles are changing color, all right? Now, let's just turn off the kill here because I think we are running into some issues with the condition there. But notice now how the color is changing based on the age. Now, the color mapper, a lot of things going on here. It's already set to age. Okay, so it's working perhaps a bit differently than our kill, but it is allowing us, let's see, can we get rid of that completely? No, it still needs to be there. Interesting. I suppose you could set different ranges here though for that. We can apply these different colors and even change the color with different noise properties as well to add some different values. So that's kind of a basic overview of conditions and really the particle systems in general. There's a lot of different modifiers in here. Some are going to be more simple than others, right? So for instance, you know, kill was pretty easy. You could also have it switch group, and that group can also mean different particle shapes, different geometry, as well as different conditions applied to it. And yeah, some of these I can't wait to dive into more, like predator, prey, flock, as well as do some work with dynamics and see just how far we can push this, because I suspect with the number of particles you are able to now emit from this basic emitter, right? You know, I showed this at the very beginning. I just have to think, or I should say, I hope that liquids are not too far off, because, you know, really, you can simulate this many particles, you're really not too far off from fluids. Okay, and so that'll be something I'm going to definitely be keeping an eye on. But that will do it for this one. If there's anything else you would like to see, please leave me a comment down below. As this is a new feature and I haven't had a bunch of time to look into it, if I got something wrong, please feel free to correct me as well down below. And if you found this video helpful, I'd appreciate it if you could like it as well as subscribe. And until next time, take care.